carriage wheels stopped turning, but Alina Whitmore's heart did not slow down with them. She sat frozen for a moment, staring at the tall iron gates of Ashworth Estate, and felt a strange tightness in her chest, as if the gates themselves were warning her to turn back. She had heard whispers about this place long before she arrived, servants who left within weeks, a master who never smiled, a house where silence lived in every corner like an unwelcome guest, and yet she had no choice. Her family needed the money, and this position, caring for an ailing old woman, was the only offer that had come her way. She stepped down from the carriage, her boots meeting the gravel with a soft crunch, and looked up at the estate before her. It stood like a giant stone creature, tall and unmoving, its windows dark despite the afternoon sun. A cold wind passed through the trees, rustling the leaves in a way that felt almost like a warning. Alina pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and took a deep breath. She reminded herself why she had come, not for comfort, not for kindness, only for survival. A woman in a gray uniform stood near the entrance, her face unreadable. This was Clara, the head housemaid, and she wasted no time with pleasantries. "You must be the new companion," Clara said, her eyes scanning Alina from head to toe. "Follow me, and listen carefully because I will not repeat myself." Alina nodded and followed her through the grand doors. Inside, the estate felt even colder than it had from the outside. The halls were long and lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow her as she walked. The floors were polished so perfectly that her footsteps echoed with every step, filling the silence with a sound that felt far too loud. "You will care for Lady Beatrice, the Duke's aunt," Clara explained, walking briskly. "She is unwell and her temper is not always kind, but she deserves patience. You will keep to your duties. You will not wander where you are not permitted. And above all," Clara paused, turning to look directly at Alina, "you will stay away from the Duke." Alina blinked, caught off guard by the sudden warning. "The Duke." "Sebastian Ashworth," Clara said, lowering her voice as though the name itself carried danger. "He is not a man who tolerates foolishness. He does not speak unless necessary, and he does not forgive mistakes. Many have come before you, hoping to impress him, hoping perhaps for more than a wage. All of them left disappointed, or worse, dismissed. Do not make the same mistake." There was something in the way Clara said it, not as a threat but as genuine advice, that made Alina take the words seriously. She had no interest in impressing a duke. She had come to earn money, not attention. Still, the warning lingered in her mind as she was led up a wide staircase and down a corridor toward the room where she would begin her new life. Lady Beatrice's chamber smelled of old lavender and medicine. The elderly woman sat propped against a mountain of pillows, her silver hair pulled into a loose braid, her eyes sharp despite her frail body. She studied Alina the moment she entered, her gaze unblinking. "So you are the new one," Lady Beatrice said, her voice raspy but strong. "Come closer, girl, let me see you properly." Alina stepped forward, standing straight despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. The old woman examined her for a long moment, then let out a short laugh. "You do not shake," Lady Beatrice said, sounding almost pleased. "Good, I cannot bear people who tremble in front of me. Most of them do, you know, afraid of this house, afraid of my nephew, afraid of their own shadows." "I am not afraid, my lady," Alina said quietly. "Only tired from the journey." "Honest too," Lady Beatrice murmured, studying her with new interest. "That will either serve you well here or destroy you quickly. We shall see which." The days that followed fell into a careful rhythm. Alina rose early, before the sun had fully lifted itself over the hills, and spent her mornings tending to Lady Beatrice, reading to her, helping her dress, listening to her stories of a younger, livelier Ashworth estate. In the afternoons she had brief moments of freedom, which she spent walking through the gardens, the only part of the estate that did not feel cold and unwelcoming. It was during one of these garden walks, on her 4th day at the estate, that she first saw him properly. She had wandered further than usual, drawn by a section of the garden filled with white roses, when she noticed a tall figure standing near the stone fountain at the garden's center. He wore a dark coat despite the mild weather, and his posture was stiff, almost guarded, as though he carried the weight of the entire estate on his shoulders. He was not looking at her. He was staring at the water, lost in some private thought, his jaw tight with an emotion Alina could not quite name. She should have turned back. Every instinct told her to retreat quietly and avoid drawing his attention. But something about the stillness of the moment, the loneliness etched into his expression, made her pause. He turned suddenly, as though sensing her presence, and their eyes met for the first time. Alina felt her breath catch, though she could not explain why. He was not smiling, he was not welcoming. His expression was unreadable, guarded, almost suspicious. Yet there was something in his eyes, a flicker of surprise perhaps, or curiosity, that softened the sharpness of his gaze for just a moment. "You are the new companion," he said finally. It was not a question. "Yes, your grace," Elena answered, offering a small, proper curtsy. "Elena Whitmore. I apologize if I have wandered into a part of the garden I should not have." He studied her for a long moment, longer than necessary, as though trying to determine something about her that could not be seen at first glance. "The garden belongs to no one in particular," he said finally. "You may walk where you like." It was such a simple statement, yet it surprised her. She had expected coldness, perhaps even irritation at her presence. Instead, there was only a quiet indifference that somehow did not feel unkind. "Thank you, your grace," she said, and turned to leave, feeling his gaze linger on her back as she walked away. That night, as she prepared Lady Beatrice for sleep, the old woman watched her with a knowing look. "You met him today, didn't you?" Lady Beatrice said. It was not really a question either. Elena hesitated. "Briefly, my lady, in the garden." "And what did you think of my nephew?" Elena considered the question carefully. "He seemed tired," she said finally. "Tired in a way that has nothing to do with sleep." Lady Beatrice's expression shifted, something like sadness passing briefly across her face. "He has been tired for a very long time," she said quietly. "Since before his father passed, since he was forced to carry a title he never wanted in a house that has never once felt like a home to him. Everyone here fears him or flatters him or wants something from him. No one simply sees him." Elena said nothing, but the words settled deep in her mind, refusing to leave. Over the following days, Elena told herself firmly that her brief encounter with the Duke meant nothing. She had a job to do, a family depending on her wages, and no room in her life for distractions, especially not distractions as complicated and dangerous as a duke who frightened his entire household into silence. Yet despite her resolve, she found herself noticing small things: the way he took his meals alone, even when guests were present; the way the staff grew tense whenever he entered a room, straightening their backs and lowering their eyes; the way he never raised his voice, not once, and yet commanded absolute obedience through nothing more than the weight of his presence. She noticed, too, the rare moments when his guard seemed to slip. Once she saw him crouched beside an injured bird near the stables, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he examined its wing. Another time, she overheard him speaking quietly to an elderly groundskeeper, asking after the man's sick wife with genuine concern in his voice, before catching himself and retreating quickly back into his usual distant formality. These small glimpses did not fit the picture the staff had painted of him. The man they described, cold, unfeeling, impossible to please, did not match the man who gently held an injured bird or asked after a servant's wife. Elena found herself wondering which version was the truth, and which was merely a mask he wore to survive the crushing weight of his position. One late afternoon, nearly 2 weeks into her stay, Elena found herself back in the garden, this time deliberately, drawn by a curiosity she refused to fully admit to herself. She found him again near the fountain, though this time he noticed her presence immediately, watching her approach without the same guarded suspicion as before. "You have returned," he observed. "I find the garden peaceful, your grace," she said honestly. "It is the only place in this estate that does not feel like it is watching me." Something flickered across his face, an emotion close to amusement, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "The house does have a way of watching," he agreed. "My ancestors perhaps disapproving from their portraits." Elena could not help the small smile that crossed her lips. It was the closest thing to humor she had heard from him, and it surprised her enough that she nearly forgot herself. "Do you often escape here, your grace?" "To avoid their disapproval." He turned to look at her fully then, studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly. "Careful, Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, though there was no real warning in his tone. "You speak far too freely for a companion who has been here only 2 weeks." "My apologies," she said, though she did not look particularly sorry, and something in his expression suggested he noticed that too. "Do not apologize," he said after a moment, his voice quieter now, almost thoughtful. "It has been a long time since anyone in this house spoke to me without measuring every word first." The admission hung in the air between them, unexpected and strangely vulnerable. Elena did not know how to respond, so she said nothing at all, and for a long moment they simply stood there in comfortable silence, the fountain trickling softly beside them, neither quite ready to walk away. She did not know it then, but that quiet moment beside the fountain would become the first thread in a story that would eventually bind their lives together, and later tear them painfully apart. For now it was simply two lonely people, standing beneath a fading sun, each wondering in their own private way if they had just found something they had not known they were searching for. The following weeks at Ashworth Estate settled into something Alina had not expected, a fragile, unspoken rhythm between herself and the Duke. She told herself daily that it meant nothing, that a shared glance in a hallway or a brief exchange of words in the garden was simply the natural result of living under the same roof. But even as she repeated this to herself, she knew it was becoming harder to believe. Lady Beatrice noticed the change first, as the elderly woman noticed most things others tried to hide. "You are humming," Lady Beatrice said one morning, as Alina helped arrange the pillows behind her. "You did not hum when you first arrived." Alina felt her cheeks warm slightly. "I did not realize I was humming, my lady." Lady Beatrice said, her sharp eyes studying Alina's face with open curiosity. "And yet here we are." She said nothing further, but the knowing look remained, and Alina busied herself with the blankets to avoid meeting her employer's gaze. It was true that something had shifted. Sebastian, though he remained formal in front of the staff, had begun seeking out small moments with her. He would appear in the garden at the same hour she took her walks, always with some excuse ready, checking on the roses, inspecting the fountain, though Alina suspected these were simply convenient reasons to be near her. She never called him on it, and he never admitted it, and this unspoken understanding became its own quiet language between them. One afternoon she found him standing near the old library, a thick book tucked beneath his arm, waiting as though he had known she would pass this way. "You read," he said, holding the book toward her. It was not quite an offer, not quite a question. "When I have the time," she replied, taking the book carefully. It was a worn copy of poetry, the pages soft with age, small handwritten notes scattered in the margins in a careful, slanted hand. "These were my father's notes," Sebastian explained, watching her flip through the pages. "He was not a warm man, my father, but he loved poetry more than he loved most people, myself included." His voice carried no real bitterness, only a tired kind of acceptance. "I thought you might enjoy it." Alina looked up at him, surprised by the gesture. "Thank you," she said softly. "I will take great care of it." "I am not concerned about the book," he said, and for a moment his usual guarded expression softened into something gentler. "I simply thought you deserved something beautiful in a house that offers so little of it." The words settled warmly in her chest, and she found herself smiling before she could stop herself. "You surprise me, Your Grace," she admitted. "The staff speak of you as though you were carved from stone." "Perhaps I was once," he said quietly. "It is easier that way. Stone does not feel disappointment when people only want what a title can offer them." He paused, his gaze drifting toward the window, toward the vast grounds beyond. "But stone also does not feel anything else, either." Alina did not know what compelled her to speak so plainly, but the words left her before she could stop them. "And what do you feel now, Your Grace?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The air between them felt charged, delicate, as though one wrong word might shatter something fragile that had been slowly building between them. "I feel," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "that I have not felt this curious about another person in a very long time." Alina's heart thudded loudly in her chest, and she quickly looked away, unsure how to respond to such an honest admission. "That is a dangerous thing to say to a companion, Your Grace." "Perhaps," he agreed, though he did not take the words back. "But I find I no longer wish to measure every word around you, Miss Whitmore. It is exhausting, pretending to be stone all the time." That evening, alone in her small room, Alina sat by the window with the book of poetry in her lap, reading his father's careful handwritten notes in the margins, trying to understand the man who had given it to her. She told herself she needed to be careful, that whatever was building between them was dangerous, impossible, doomed from the very start. A duke did not fall for a paid companion. It simply did not happen, not in any story she had ever heard. And yet, despite every warning bell ringing in her mind, she found herself looking forward to the next morning, to the next accidental meeting in the garden, to the next quiet conversation that stretched longer than propriety would allow. Days passed, then weeks, and the small moments between them multiplied, each one a little braver than the last. He began joining her during Lady Beatrice's afternoon rest, when the old woman slept and Alina had a rare hour to herself. They would walk the far edges of the estate, past the formal gardens, into the wilder meadows where wildflowers grew untamed and the estate's watching eyes could not quite reach them. It was during one of these walks that Alina finally asked the question she had been holding back for weeks. "Why does everyone fear you so much?" she asked, watching him carefully. "I do not see the man they describe." Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "My father taught me that fear was more useful than love," he said finally. "He said people would take advantage of kindness, but they would respect fear. I did not want to believe him, not at first. But I watched him rule this estate for 30 years, watched everyone bow and scrape and obey him without question, and I thought perhaps he was right." "And now," Alina pressed gently, "do you still believe that?" He turned to look at her, something raw and uncertain flickering across his face. "I am no longer certain of anything I believed before you arrived," he admitted quietly. The confession hung between them, heavy and honest, and Alina felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth she had not expected to feel, especially not for a man everyone had warned her to avoid. "I am only a companion, Your Grace," she said softly, though her voice lacked conviction even to her own ears. "I have no title, no fortune. Whatever this is between us, it cannot lead anywhere good." "I know," he said simply, and the honesty of his admission somehow made everything worse and better all at once. "But I find I no longer care about what it should or should not lead to. I only know that I look forward to seeing you more than I have looked forward to anything in a very long time." Alina did not have a response for that, so instead she simply reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against his, a small gesture that carried far more weight than words could have offered. He did not pull away. Instead, his fingers curled gently around hers, and for a long moment they simply stood there in the wild meadow, hands joined, saying nothing at all, needing nothing else in that quiet moment beneath the wide open sky. It was Clara who broke the illusion of their private world. She found Alina later that evening, folding linens in the small servants' quarters, and her expression was grim, careful, as though she were about to deliver difficult news. "I saw you," Clara said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one else could hear, "in the meadow with the Duke." Alina's stomach dropped, but she kept her expression steady. "We were simply walking, Clara." "I do not doubt your intentions," Clara said, her voice softening slightly with something close to sympathy. "But I have worked in this house for 15 years, Alina. I have seen young women grow fond of this family before, and I have seen how it ends. It never ends well, not for women like us." "What do you mean?" Alina asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer. "I mean," Clara said carefully, "that a duke may fall in love with a companion in the quiet corners of his estate, where no one from society is watching. But the moment the world learns of it, that love becomes a scandal, a weakness to be corrected, a mistake to be erased. His mother will not allow it, his position will not allow it, and you, Alina, will be the one left with nothing, while he returns to his title and his duties as though nothing happened at all." The warning settled cold and heavy in Alina's chest, but she found herself unwilling to fully accept it. "You do not know him as I do," she said quietly, though even as she spoke the words, doubt crept in at the edges. Clara's expression softened with something close to pity. "I hope for your sake that you are right," she said. "But I have seen this story before, and it has never once had a happy ending." That night Alina lay awake long after the house had gone silent, Clara's warning echoing endlessly in her mind. She thought of Sebastian's honest admission in the meadow, the warmth in his voice, the way his fingers had curled so gently around hers. She wanted desperately to believe that what existed between them was strong enough to survive whatever obstacles society might place in their path. But somewhere deep inside, a small, quiet voice reminded her that fairy tales rarely survived contact with reality, and that dukes, no matter how gentle they seemed in private gardens and wild meadows, ultimately belonged to a world that would never fully accept a woman like her. She fell asleep with the book of poetry still clutched in her hands, its worn pages a small, fragile comfort against the uncertainty pressing down upon her heart. The crisis arrived without warning, as most crises do, breaking apart the fragile peace of the estate in a single terrifying night. Alina woke to the sound of frantic footsteps in the hallway outside her room, followed by a sharp knock that made her sit upright instantly, her heart already pounding before she fully understood why. Clara stood in the doorway, her usually composed face pale with worry. It is Lady Beatrice, Clara said, her voice tight. She has taken a turn. The doctor has been sent for, but you must come quickly. Elena threw on her robe and hurried down the corridor, her bare feet cold against the polished floor, her mind racing with fear for the old woman who had, despite her sharp tongue, become someone Elena had grown genuinely fond of over the past weeks. When she reached Lady Beatrice's chamber, she found the room already crowded with worried staff, candles lit against the darkness, and in the center of it all Sebastian, kneeling beside his aunt's bed, holding her frail hand with an expression of raw fear that Elena had never seen on him before. Gone was the composed, guarded duke who measured every word. In his place was simply a frightened nephew, watching helplessly as someone he loved struggled to breathe. Elena, Lady Beatrice whispered weakly, her sharp eyes finding her through the dim candlelight. There you are. I am here, my lady, Elena said, moving quickly to the other side of the bed, taking the old woman's other hand in hers. The doctor is coming, you must rest until he arrives. Rest, Lady Beatrice repeated with a faint, tired laugh. I have been resting for years, child. Perhaps it is finally time for something else. Do not speak that way, Sebastian said sharply, his voice cracking with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. You will recover, you always recover. Lady Beatrice turned her gaze toward her nephew, her expression softening with something close to sadness. Sebastian, she said quietly, you have spent your whole life believing that strength means never showing weakness. But strength, my dear boy, is allowing yourself to feel fear, and facing it honestly rather than hiding behind stone walls. The doctor arrived shortly after, ushering everyone but immediate family from the room, though Elena, given her role as Lady Beatrice's companion, was permitted to remain nearby in the adjoining sitting room. Sebastian paced the small space restlessly, his composure completely abandoned, his hands trembling slightly as he ran them through his hair again and again. She will be all right, Elena said softly, though she had no real way of knowing this to be true. You do not know that, Sebastian said, his voice raw. No one knows that. The doctor will not say it, the staff will not say it, and I cannot bear the silence any longer. He stopped pacing and sank into a nearby chair, burying his face in his hands. She is the only person in this family who ever looked at me and saw more than a title, if I lose her. He did not finish the sentence, but he did not need to. Elena moved to sit beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, and after a moment of hesitation she reached out and gently took his hand, offering the only comfort she knew how to give. Tell me about her, Elena said quietly. Tell me who she was before all of this. Sebastian looked at her, surprised by the request, but something in her steady gaze seemed to calm the storm behind his eyes, and slowly, haltingly, he began to speak. She practically raised me, he said, his voice quieter now, less guarded. My mother was always occupied with society, with appearances, with maintaining the family's reputation. My father was distant, consumed with duty and expectation. But Aunt Beatrice, she used to sneak me sweets from the kitchen when I was small, and she taught me to read using books my father considered far too common for a future duke. She used to say that titles were simply costumes people wore, and that the person underneath mattered far more than the coat they were forced to put on. She sounds like a remarkable woman, Elena said softly. She is, Sebastian said, correcting himself with quiet determination, as though refusing to speak of his aunt in the past tense. She has always been the only person in this house who never once made me feel like a burden or a disappointment or simply an obligation to be managed. They sat together through the long hours of the night, Sebastian speaking softly of childhood memories, of stolen afternoons in the kitchen garden, of quiet lessons taught with patience his own parents had never shown him. Elena listened without judgment, offering gentle questions when the silence grew too heavy, and slowly, painfully, Sebastian allowed himself to speak of things he had clearly never shared with anyone before. I never wanted this life, he admitted quietly, somewhere near dawn, his voice barely above a whisper. The title, the estate, the endless expectations. I used to dream of simply disappearing, of becoming someone ordinary, someone who could choose his own path without the weight of an entire family name pressing down on every decision. Why did you never leave? Elena asked gently. Duty, he said simply, and fear perhaps that without the title I would discover there was nothing else underneath it, that my father was right and stone was truly all I had to offer. I do not believe that, Elena said firmly, surprising even herself with the certainty in her voice. I have seen you kneel beside an injured bird with more gentleness than most men show their own families. I have seen you ask after a sick servant's wife with genuine concern. Whatever your father believed, Sebastian, you are not made of stone. He turned to look at her then, something vulnerable and grateful softening his tired features. You are the first person who has ever said that to me and truly meant it, he said quietly. Then perhaps it is time someone did, Elena replied. The doctor emerged from Lady Beatrice's chamber just as the first light of dawn began creeping through the sitting room windows, his expression tired but cautiously hopeful. She is stable, he announced, and Elena felt Sebastian's entire body sag with relief beside her. Her heart is weak, and she will need careful rest and attention in the coming weeks, but she has survived the worst of it tonight. Sebastian rose immediately, moving toward his aunt's chamber, then paused at the threshold and turned back toward Elena, his eyes searching hers with an expression she could not quite name. Thank you, he said quietly, for staying with me tonight, for listening. I do not know how I would have survived those hours without you beside me. You do not need to thank me, Elena said softly. I care for her too, and I care for you, Sebastian, more than I probably should. The admission left her lips before she could stop it, and for a moment, fear flickered through her at her own boldness. But Sebastian only stepped closer, his expression open and unguarded in a way she had never seen before, and gently reached out to brush a stray strand of hair from her face. I care for you too, he said quietly, more than I know what to do with if I am honest. The moment stretched between them, fragile and full of unspoken possibility, before the sound of approaching footsteps forced them apart, each retreating quickly into their proper roles as the household staff began their morning routines. In the days that followed, Lady Beatrice slowly recovered, though the crisis had clearly shaken the entire household, and Sebastian in particular. He began spending nearly every free moment either at his aunt's bedside or in Elena's company, the careful distance he had once maintained between himself and his household now completely abandoned. You have changed, Lady Beatrice observed one afternoon, watching her nephew with sharp, knowing eyes as he sat beside her bed, laughing softly at something Elena had said. Have I? Sebastian asked, though the small smile playing at his lips suggested he already knew the answer. You smile now, Lady Beatrice said, genuinely, not the polite mask you have worn since your father's passing. I had begun to wonder if you had forgotten how. Sebastian glanced toward Elena, who busied herself arranging medicine bottles on the bedside table, pretending not to listen, though a small smile tugged at her own lips. Perhaps I simply needed the right reason to remember, he said quietly. Lady Beatrice's expression grew thoughtful, almost sad, as she studied the two of them together. Be careful, my dears, she said softly. The world outside these garden walls is not always kind to stories like the one you are writing for yourselves. Your mother will not approve, Sebastian, and society will be far crueler than my sharp tongue has ever been. I know, Sebastian said, his jaw tightening slightly. But for the first time in my life, I find myself unwilling to let fear of disapproval dictate my choices. Elena felt her heart swell at his words, even as a small, quiet fear lingered beneath the warmth, a fear that Lady Beatrice's warning carried more truth than either of them wanted to admit. She pushed the worry aside, choosing instead to hold onto the fragile happiness that had bloomed so unexpectedly within the cold walls of Ashworth Estate, unaware of how soon that happiness would be tested by forces far more powerful than either of them could withstand alone. That evening, as the sun set golden and warm over the estate grounds, Sebastian found Elena in the garden once more, standing beside the fountain where they had first truly spoken weeks earlier. He approached quietly, and for a long moment they simply stood together, watching the light fade slowly into evening. I used to hate this fountain, Sebastian admitted quietly. My father would stand here for hours, lost in thoughts he never shared with anyone, and I would watch from my window, wondering what kind of man could feel so much and share so little. And now, Elena asked softly. Now, Sebastian said, turning to look at her, his expression open and honest in the fading light, I think of this fountain differently. I think of the first time I truly saw you here, and I wonder if perhaps my father was simply lonely, in a way I never understood until I nearly lost the chance to feel something different myself. He reached for her hand, and this time neither of them hesitated, their fingers intertwining naturally, comfortably, as though they had always belonged together. Elena leaned her head gently against his shoulder, and for a long, precious moment, the weight of the world outside the garden walls seemed to disappear entirely, leaving only the two of them, standing together beneath a sky painted gold and rose, daring to believe for just a little while longer that their fragile happiness might somehow be allowed to survive. The weeks that followed felt to Elena like living inside a dream she feared would end the moment she woke. Lady Beatrice continued her slow recovery, growing stronger each day, and with her recovery came a lightness in the estate that Elena had not thought possible when she first arrived beneath those tall iron gates. Sebastian no longer bothered hiding his fondness for her, though they remained careful in front of the staff, aware of how quickly whispers could spread through a household. But in private moments, in the garden, in the quiet library where he continued to share his father's old books with her, in the stolen minutes after Lady Beatrice had fallen asleep for her afternoon rest, they allowed themselves to simply exist together, without pretense, without the heavy titles that separated them in the eyes of the world. "Tell me something no one else knows about you," Elena said one afternoon, as they sat together on a stone bench overlooking the estate's small orchard, apples beginning to ripen on the branches above them. Sebastian considered the question seriously, as he considered most things. "I wanted to be an architect," he admitted finally. "When I was young, before I understood the weight of what I would inherit, I used to draw buildings for hours. Bridges, houses, entire imagined cities. My father found the drawings once and told me such dreams were beneath a future duke. I burned them that same night, though I still remember the shape of nearly every building I drew." "That is a beautiful dream," Elena said softly. "I am sorry you were made to feel ashamed of it." "And you," Sebastian asked, turning the question back toward her, "what dream have you buried, Miss Whitmore?" Elena smiled faintly, though there was a touch of sadness behind it. "I wanted to teach," she said. "Children specifically. I love the way they see the world before it teaches them to be cautious and guarded. But my family needed income more than I needed dreams, and companion work paid better than a small village schoolhouse ever could." "Perhaps," Sebastian said thoughtfully, "dreams delayed are not dreams lost. Perhaps there is still time for both of us to become the people we once imagined." Elena looked at him carefully, searching his expression for any sign of the impossible hope rising in her own chest. "Do you truly believe that, Sebastian? Or is it simply easier to say such things beneath an orchard, far from the reality waiting for us beyond these gardens?" His expression grew serious, and he took her hand gently in his. "I believe," he said quietly, "that for the first time since my father's passing I want more from my life than duty and obligation. I want this, Elena. Whatever this is between us, I do not yet know how we make it possible, but I know I no longer wish to imagine a future that does not include you." The words settled deep in her chest, warm and terrifying all at once. She wanted desperately to believe him, to trust that whatever fragile happiness they had built together could somehow withstand the world waiting beyond the estate's walls. But somewhere beneath the joy, a quiet unease remained, a small voice that echoed Clara's warning from weeks before, reminding her how rarely stories like theirs ended happily. She pushed the doubt aside and allowed herself, just for that afternoon, to simply be happy. Their closeness did not go entirely unnoticed. The household staff, though careful never to speak openly of it, began exchanging quiet glances whenever the Duke and the companion were mentioned in the same breath. Clara, in particular, watched the growing bond between them with visible worry, though she said nothing further after her initial warning, perhaps recognizing that Elena's heart was already too deeply invested to be swayed by caution alone. It was Lady Beatrice who eventually addressed the matter directly, calling Elena to her side one quiet evening as the household settled for the night. "You love him," Lady Beatrice said simply without preamble, her sharp eyes studying Elena's face in the candlelight. Elena did not bother denying it. "I do," she admitted softly. "More than I ever expected to, and far sooner than I thought wise." Lady Beatrice's expression softened with something close to tenderness. "I have watched my nephew struggle beneath the weight of this family's expectations for his entire life," she said quietly. "I have watched him become someone hardened and distant, someone I barely recognized from the sweet boy who once followed me through the kitchen garden asking endless questions about everything in the world. But these past weeks, watching him with you, I have seen glimpses of that boy again. For that, my dear, I am deeply grateful." "But," Elena asked, sensing the unspoken concern behind the old woman's words. But Lady Beatrice continued, her voice heavy with genuine worry. My sister-in-law, Sebastian's mother, is not a woman easily moved by matters of the heart. She has spent her entire life building this family's reputation, and she will not welcome a companion, however wonderful, into a role she has already planned for someone of far greater social standing. I do not say this to discourage you, Elena. I say this because I care for you both, and I fear the storm that may be building beyond these garden walls, one neither of you may yet be prepared to weather. Elena felt a chill settle over her despite the warm evening air. Do you believe she already knows? I do not know, Lady Beatrice admitted, but word travels quickly, even within estate walls as large as ours. I would advise caution, my dear, not because your feelings are wrong, but because the world you are stepping into can be far crueler than either of you yet understands. That night Elena lay awake once more, Lady Beatrice's warning echoing alongside Clara's earlier caution, both women who knew this world far better than she did, both offering the same quiet fear beneath their different words. She thought of Sebastian's promise beneath the orchard trees, his certainty that he wanted a future with her, and she desperately wanted to believe that certainty was strong enough to withstand whatever challenges awaited them. But deep within her, a small, frightened part of her heart had already begun preparing for the possibility that their fragile happiness might not survive contact with the world beyond Ashworth's tall iron gates. The following morning, however, brought no immediate storm, only another quiet, golden day that allowed Elena to push her fears aside once more. Sebastian found her early, before her duties with Lady Beatrice began, waiting near the garden entrance with an expression of barely contained excitement that she had rarely seen on him before. "Come with me," he said, extending his hand. "There is something I want to show you before the day fully begins." Curious, Elena took his hand and allowed him to lead her through the estate grounds, past the formal gardens, toward a small, overgrown structure she had never noticed before, tucked away near the edge of the eastern woods. It was a small stone cottage, clearly abandoned for years, ivy climbing thick across its weathered walls. "What is this place?" Elena asked, studying the forgotten little building with curiosity. "It belonged to the estate's gardener, generations ago," Sebastian explained, his eyes bright with an enthusiasm that transformed his usually serious features into something almost boyish. "I found it years ago when I was young and desperate for somewhere private, somewhere away from my father's watchful expectations. I have not shown it to anyone since." Elena felt a warmth spread through her chest at the significance of the gesture. "You are showing me now." "Yes," Sebastian said softly, turning to face her fully, "because I find I no longer wish to keep pieces of myself hidden from you, Elena. Not this cottage, not my childhood dreams, not any part of who I truly am beneath the title I was born into." He led her inside the small structure, dusty and neglected, but still holding a quiet, forgotten charm, sunlight filtering through grimy windows in soft golden beams. "I used to imagine," Sebastian continued quietly, "that one day I might restore this place. Not as a duke's retreat, but simply as a home, a place where titles and expectations could not follow." "It is beautiful," Elena said honestly, looking around at the simple stone walls, imagining what the space might become with careful attention and love. "I am glad you think so," Sebastian said, reaching for her hand once more, "because I find myself hoping, perhaps foolishly, that one day I might restore it together with you." Elena's breath caught at the quiet weight of his words, understanding the depth of what he was truly suggesting, even without him stating it outright. She wanted to answer him honestly, to tell him that she hoped for the very same future, but the fear that had been building steadily within her these past weeks finally found its voice. "Sebastian," she said carefully, "I want that too, more than I know how to express, but I am frightened. Your mother, society, everything standing between a duke and a companion feels like an impossible mountain to climb." "I know," Sebastian said softly, pulling her gently closer. "I am frightened too, if I am honest, but I would rather face that mountain with you beside me than continue living a comfortable, empty life without you in it." Standing together within the forgotten cottage, sunlight warming the dusty stone floor beneath their feet, Elena allowed herself, one final time, to believe fully in the possibility of their future together, unaware that the mountain Sebastian spoke of was already beginning to form, far closer and far more dangerous than either of them yet realized. The letter arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, carried by a rider who had traveled through the night, and its arrival changed the atmosphere of Ashworth Estate before Elena even understood what it contained. She noticed it first in Clara's face, tight with worry as she hurried through the halls, and then in the sudden tension that gripped the household staff, whispers passing between them in hushed, careful tones. "The Dowager Duchess is coming," Clara finally told Elena, catching her alone near the linen closets. "She arrives within the week." Elena felt her stomach drop. She had heard enough about Sebastian's mother during her time at the estate to understand the significance of this news. Margaret Ashworth rarely visited the estate, preferring the busier social circles of the city, but when she did return, the entire household reorganized itself around her exacting standards and sharp judgment. "Does the Duke know?" Elena asked. "He received the letter this morning," Clara said. "I do not know what news prompted her sudden visit, but I have never seen him look quite so uneasy about his mother's arrival." Elena found Sebastian later that afternoon in his study, staring at the letter still clutched in his hand, his expression grim in a way she had not seen since the night of his aunt's crisis. "What does she want?" Elena asked gently, closing the study door behind her. Sebastian looked up, and for a moment something like fear flickered across his features before he carefully composed himself. "She writes that she has heard concerning rumors about my conduct," he said quietly. "She does not specify what rumors, but I suspect I do not need her to." Elena's heart sank. "She knows about us." "Perhaps," Sebastian admitted, "or perhaps she suspects. Either way, she is coming to investigate, and my mother's investigations are rarely subtle or kind." "What should we do?" Elena asked, unable to keep the worry from her voice. Sebastian rose from his desk and crossed the room to stand before her, taking her hands gently in his. "We do nothing differently," he said firmly. "I will not hide what I feel for you, Elena, not even from my mother. Whatever storm she brings, we will face it together honestly." Elena wanted desperately to believe his confidence, but a cold unease had settled deep within her, one that no amount of reassurance could fully dispel. The Dowager Duchess arrived 4 days later, her carriage sweeping through the estate gates with an air of authority that seemed to command even the trees to stand straighter in her presence. Elena watched from an upstairs window as Margaret Ashworth stepped down, dressed in severe black, her silver hair pulled into a tight, immaculate knot, her expression cold and assessing even from a distance. Dinner that first evening was a tense, formal affair. Elena, given her position, was not expected to dine with the family, but she caught glimpses of the Dowager Duchess throughout the household, watching everything and everyone with sharp, calculating eyes that missed nothing. It was 2 days into her visit when the confrontation Elena had been dreading finally arrived. She had been summoned, quite unexpectedly, to the estate's formal sitting room, a space Elena had rarely entered during her weeks at Ashworth. Margaret Ashworth sat rigidly upright in a high-backed chair near the window, her expression unreadable as Elena entered and offered a proper, careful curtsy. "You may sit," Margaret said, though her tone made clear this was not truly an invitation but a command. Elena sat carefully on the edge of a nearby chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. "I understand you have been my son's aunt's companion for some months now," Margaret began, her voice carrying the practiced smoothness of someone accustomed to controlling every conversation she entered. "Yes, Your Grace," Elena replied. "And I understand," Margaret continued, her sharp eyes fixed intently on Elena's face, "that you have become considerably more than that in recent weeks." Elena's breath caught, but she forced herself to remain composed. "I care deeply for your son, Your Grace, if that is what you are asking." Something flickered across Margaret's expression, though whether it was anger or simply cold calculation, Elena could not quite determine. "I appreciate your honesty," Margaret said finally. "Most young women in your position would attempt to deny such an obvious truth. Perhaps that honesty is what has attracted my son's attention. He has always valued sincerity over flattery, unlike most of the women society has paraded before him." Elena remained silent, sensing that Margaret was building toward something, and unwilling to interrupt whatever calculated point the older woman intended to make. "Let me be equally honest with you, Miss Whitmore," Margaret continued, her voice hardening slightly. "I do not doubt your feelings are genuine, nor do I doubt my son's feelings toward you. But feelings, however genuine, are not sufficient foundation for the life my son is required to lead." "With respect, Your Grace," Elena said carefully, "I believe that decision belongs to your son." Margaret's expression tightened, though her composure remained perfectly intact. "My son," she said, "carries the weight of an entire family legacy on his shoulders. Every decision he makes ripples outward, affecting not only himself, but every servant employed on this estate, every tenant farmer whose livelihood depends on this family's continued standing, every business relationship built over generations. Should he choose to marry a companion with no title, no fortune, and no social standing, the consequences would extend far beyond his own happiness." "What consequences exactly?" Alina asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. "Society would turn against him," Margaret said bluntly. "Doors that have remained open to this family for generations would close. Business partners would question his judgment. Political allies would distance themselves, fearing association with scandal. And you, Miss Whitmore, would spend the rest of your life being whispered about, judged, never truly accepted by the world he must continue to navigate." "Sebastian does not care about such things," Alina said, though her voice wavered slightly with uncertainty. "Not now, perhaps," Margaret agreed, her tone softening with something that almost resembled genuine sympathy, though Alina suspected it was simply a more effective tool of persuasion. "Love makes fools of even the most sensible men, Miss Whitmore, but love fades eventually, when faced with years of social exile, financial strain, and the slow erosion of everything he was raised to protect. And when that fading occurs, my dear, I fear he will come to resent you for the sacrifice he made, and you will be left with nothing but the wreckage of a love that could not withstand reality." The words struck Alina like physical blows, each one carrying just enough truth to feel devastatingly plausible. She thought of Clara's warning, of Lady Beatrice's careful caution, and felt the weight of every fear she had tried desperately to push aside these past weeks. "I do not say this to be cruel," Margaret continued, her voice gentler now, though no less calculated. "I say this because I have watched my son struggle beneath expectations his entire life, and I do not wish to see him destroyed by a love that, however genuine, cannot survive the world he was born into. If you truly love him, Miss Whitmore, you will understand that sometimes love means releasing someone, rather than binding them to a future that will ultimately break them." Alina felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall in front of this composed, calculating woman. "What are you asking of me, Your Grace?" Margaret's expression grew serious, almost solemn. "I am asking you to leave," she said simply, quietly, without confrontation, without explanation that might tempt him to chase after you against his own better interests. "I will ensure you receive generous compensation for your discretion, enough to secure your family's comfort for years to come. But you must go, Miss Whitmore, before this attachment grows any deeper than it already has, before the damage becomes irreversible for us all." Alina sat in stunned silence, the weight of the request pressing down on her chest like a physical force. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to trust in Sebastian's earlier promise that they would face any storm together. But Margaret's words had planted seeds of doubt that grew rapidly within her, watered by weeks of quiet warnings from those who understood this world far better than she did. "I need time to consider this," Alina finally managed to say. "Of course," Margaret said, rising gracefully from her chair, signaling the conversation's end. "But I would advise against too much deliberation, Miss Whitmore. The longer this continues, the more painful the eventual separation will become for everyone involved." That night Alina barely slept, Margaret's calculated warnings replaying endlessly in her mind, alongside memories of Sebastian's gentle promises beneath the orchard trees, his certainty that their love was worth fighting for. She wanted desperately to believe in that certainty, to trust that their bond could withstand whatever society threw against it. But as dawn broke gray and cold over the estate grounds, Alina found herself increasingly convinced of a painful truth. Her love for Sebastian was genuine, perhaps the most genuine feeling she had ever known. But genuine feelings, she feared, were not always enough to overcome the weight of the world standing against them. She thought of Sebastian's tired eyes, the exhaustion that had lived behind them before she arrived, the crushing expectations he had carried his entire life. She thought of Margaret's warning that love, however strong, could eventually curdle into resentment beneath years of social exile and hardship. And slowly, painfully, a decision began forming within her, one born not of weakness, but of a desperate, selfless desire to protect the man she loved from a future that might ultimately destroy him. She did not yet know if she possessed the strength to follow through with what she was beginning to consider. But as the morning light spread slowly across her small room, Illuminating the worn book of poetry still resting on her bedside table, Elena felt the fragile happiness of the past weeks beginning to crumble beneath the weight of an impossible choice, one that would ultimately determine not only her own future, but the future of a man who had, for the briefest and most beautiful moment, allowed himself to believe that stone could learn to feel again. 3 days passed before Elena reached her final decision, 3 days during which she moved through her duties like someone caught in a fog, smiling when necessary, speaking when spoken to, all while a war raged silently within her heart. She avoided Sebastian as much as her position allowed, terrified that one look into his warm, hopeful eyes would completely dissolve her resolve. Lady Beatrice noticed the change immediately. "Something is troubling you," the old woman observed one afternoon, watching Elena with sharp, concerned eyes as she arranged fresh flowers beside the bed. "You have grown quiet these past days." Elena forced a small smile, unwilling to burden the recovering woman with the weight of her impossible decision. "Simply tired, my lady." "Nothing more." Lady Beatrice did not appear convinced, but she did not press further, perhaps sensing that Elena needed space to work through whatever troubled her privately. Elena was grateful for the reprieve, though guilt gnawed at her for the deception. She avoided Sebastian for 2 full days, offering brief, distracted excuses whenever he sought her company, watching with quiet heartbreak as confusion and hurt gradually replaced the warmth in his eyes. She knew she was being cruel, avoiding honest conversation, but she feared that honesty would only strengthen his resolve to fight for their impossible future, a fight she had become convinced would ultimately destroy him. On the 3rd night, unable to bear the weight of her decision any longer, Elena made her choice. She would leave. Not through confrontation, not through painful explanations that might tempt Sebastian to abandon everything for her sake, but quietly, cleanly, in a way that left him confused perhaps, hurt certainly, but ultimately free to continue the life his position demanded of him. She told herself this was an act of love, the deepest sacrifice she could offer him, protecting him from a future Margaret had painted so convincingly, a future of social exile and eventual resentment. She packed her few belongings late that night, her hands trembling as she folded the small collection of dresses she had brought with her months earlier. She paused when she reached the worn book of poetry Sebastian had given her, his father's careful handwriting still visible in the margins. She held it for a long moment, tears finally falling freely down her cheeks, before carefully placing it back on the small bedside table, unable to bring herself to take something so precious, something that felt too much like taking a piece of him with her. She considered writing a letter, some explanation that might soften the blow of her sudden departure, but every attempt she made felt inadequate, either revealing too much of Margaret's interference, which might send Sebastian into a confrontation with his own mother, or revealing too little, leaving him with no understanding at all. In the end, she decided silence was kinder than an explanation that could not possibly convey the depth of her sacrifice without risking everything she was trying to protect. Dawn arrived gray and quiet, mist clinging low to the estate grounds as Elena made her way carefully through the sleeping household, her small bag clutched tightly in one hand. She had arranged, through a brief and painful conversation with Clara the previous evening, for a carriage to meet her at the estate's rear gate, away from the main entrance where she might be more easily noticed. Clara had not asked many questions, though her expression had carried a quiet, knowing sadness that suggested she understood far more than Elena had explained. "You are certain of this?" Clara had asked gently. "I am certain it is necessary," Elena had replied, though her voice had betrayed how far that certainty was from genuine conviction. As Elena moved silently through the estate's main hallway, her footsteps carefully quiet against the polished floor, fate placed one final, cruel obstacle in her path. Sebastian emerged from his study, clearly having risen early himself, his expression shifting immediately from surprise to confusion as he took in the sight of her, dressed for travel, bag in hand, at such an early hour. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying immediate concern, "what is happening? Where are you going?" Elena felt her carefully constructed resolve threatening to crumble entirely at the sight of him, his hair still slightly disheveled from sleep, his eyes searching hers with genuine worry. Every instinct within her screamed to run to him, to explain everything, to let him fight the battle he had promised to fight beside her. But Margaret's warning echoed loudly in her mind, alongside the terrifying image of Sebastian slowly losing everything, everyone, eventually even his love for her, beneath the crushing weight of social exile. She forced herself to remain composed, drawing on every ounce of strength she possessed. "I must leave, Your Grace," she said, her voice carefully formal, carefully distant, a painful contrast to the warmth that had existed between them just days earlier. Confusion deepened into something closer to alarm on Sebastian's face. "Leave, Elena, what has happened? Talk to me, please." "There is nothing to discuss," Elena said, forcing the words past the painful tightness in her throat. "I have simply realized that my position here is no longer suitable. I am grateful for the kindness you and Lady Beatrice have shown me, but it is time for me to move forward with my life." "I do not believe you," Sebastian said, stepping closer, his expression a mixture of hurt and desperate confusion. "Something has changed these past days. You have been distant, avoiding me. Please, Elena, whatever it is, we can face it together as I promised." The sincerity in his voice nearly broke her completely, but Elena forced herself to remember Margaret's warning, the image of Sebastian slowly resenting her, slowly losing everything he had ever known because of a love that could not survive the world's harsh judgment. "There is nothing to face, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady despite the devastating pain tearing through her chest. "I simply believe it is time for me to leave." Sebastian searched her face desperately, clearly sensing the lie behind her carefully composed words, yet unable to identify exactly what had changed so dramatically in such a short time. "Please," he said quietly, his voice breaking slightly, "do not do this. Whatever has frightened you, we can overcome it. I meant every word I said to you beneath the orchard trees, Elena. I still mean them now." Elena felt tears threatening once more, but she forced them back, knowing that if she allowed herself even a moment of visible weakness, her entire resolve would shatter completely. She took a deep, steadying breath and offered him the only thing she could bring herself to give, a small, formal curtsy, the same gesture she might have offered any duke upon their first meeting, cold and proper and utterly devastating in its distance from the warmth they had shared. "Goodbye, Your Grace," she said quietly, and before he could respond, before he could reach for her or offer any further protest, she turned and walked steadily toward the estate's rear entrance, forcing herself not to look back, though every step felt like tearing a piece of her own heart away and leaving it behind within those cold stone walls. Behind her, she heard Sebastian call her name once, his voice raw with confusion and pain, but she did not turn around. She could not turn around, knowing that if she looked back at him even once, she would lose whatever fragile courage remained within her. The carriage waited exactly where Clara had promised, and Elena climbed inside quickly, her entire body trembling as the driver set the horses into motion, carrying her steadily away from the tall iron gates of Ashworth Estate, away from the only genuine happiness she had known in years, away from a man whose gentle eyes and quiet vulnerability had taught her that stone could indeed learn to feel again. She allowed herself to cry only once the estate had disappeared completely from view, her silent tears falling freely as the carriage carried her toward an uncertain future, her heart shattered by a sacrifice she desperately hoped would prove worthwhile, though even in that moment, a small, painful doubt lingered, wondering if she had just made the greatest mistake of her life in the name of protecting a love she was no longer certain needed protecting at all. Behind her, within the quiet halls of Ashworth Estate, Sebastian stood frozen in the exact spot where she had left him, staring at the empty hallway where she had disappeared, utterly unable to comprehend what had just occurred. He did not yet understand the depth of his mother's interference, did not yet know of the calculated warnings that had driven Elena to such a devastating, selfless choice. He knew only that the woman he had allowed himself to love, fully and completely for the first time in his guarded life, had curtsied to him as though he were nothing more than a passing acquaintance, and walked silently out of his life, leaving behind nothing but confusion, heartbreak, and a silence that would prove far louder and more destructive than any argument could ever have been. The months following Elena's departure transformed Sebastian into a man his own household barely recognized. He performed his duties with mechanical precision, attending business meetings, reviewing estate accounts, greeting visiting dignitaries with polite, practiced words that carried no genuine warmth behind them. To outside observers, nothing appeared particularly wrong. The Duke of Ashworth continued managing his affairs with the same competent efficiency he always had. But those who knew him well, Lady Beatrice most of all, watched with growing concern as the small flickers of genuine warmth that had briefly transformed him during Elena's presence slowly extinguished themselves entirely, replaced once more by the cold, guarded distance that had defined him before her arrival, though now carrying an additional weight of quiet devastation beneath the surface. He stopped visiting the garden fountain, unable to bear the memories that space now held. He avoided the small stone cottage near the eastern woods entirely, the forgotten little building he had once dreamed of restoring alongside her, now simply another painful reminder of a future that had slipped through his fingers without warning or explanation. He kept the worn book of poetry, discovered still resting on her abandoned bedside table, locked carefully within his desk drawer, unable to look at it directly, yet equally unable to remove it from his possession entirely. "You must eat something," Lady Beatrice insisted one evening, watching her nephew push food listlessly around his plate during their quiet dinner together. "You have grown thin these past weeks, Sebastian. This cannot continue." "I am simply occupied with estate matters," Sebastian replied, his voice carrying the same flat, distant tone that had become his constant companion since Alina's sudden departure. "You are lying to yourself as much as you are lying to me," Lady Beatrice said gently, though her sharp eyes carried genuine worry beneath their usual bluntness. "You have not been the same since she left, Sebastian. I have watched you retreat further into yourself with each passing week, and I fear where this path eventually leads." Sebastian's jaw tightened, the closest visible reaction to genuine emotion he allowed himself these days. "She made her choice clear, Aunt Beatrice. She curtsied to me as though I were a stranger and walked away without explanation. What more is there to understand?" "Perhaps more than either of us currently realizes," Lady Beatrice said carefully, though she did not elaborate further, unwilling to voice suspicions she could not yet fully confirm. Sebastian did not press her further, retreating instead into the numb, mechanical routine that had become his only defense against the devastating confusion and hurt that threatened to overwhelm him whenever he allowed himself to fully consider Alina's departure. He replayed their final conversation endlessly in his mind, searching desperately for some clue he might have missed, some explanation for her sudden, inexplicable coldness after weeks of genuine warmth and connection between them. He considered more than once seeking her out directly, tracking down wherever she had gone, demanding the honest explanation she had refused to offer before leaving. But each time the thought arose, a cold, defeated voice within him reminded him of her formal curtsy, the careful distance in her voice, the clear finality of her chosen words. She had made her decision, he told himself repeatedly. Whatever had changed within her, she had clearly decided their brief happiness together was not worth fighting to preserve. Meanwhile, though Sebastian remained unaware, his mother watched his slow deterioration with a growing, uncomfortable weight of guilt she refused to fully acknowledge, even to herself. Margaret Ashworth had convinced herself, during her conversation with Alina weeks earlier, that she was acting in her son's best interest, protecting him from a future of social exile and eventual resentment that she genuinely believed would destroy him far more thoroughly than any temporary heartbreak. But watching him now hollow and distant, moving through his days like a man simply enduring existence rather than genuinely living, Margaret found herself questioning quietly and privately whether her calculated intervention had truly protected her son, or whether she had simply exchanged one form of destruction for another, perhaps crueler still, because this particular devastation carried no clear villain for him to direct his pain toward, no obstacle he could fight against. Only an empty confusion that offered no resolution at all. She said nothing of her role in Alina's departure, telling herself repeatedly that revealing the truth now would serve no purpose beyond causing further pain, and perhaps, if she was honest with herself, beyond exposing her own uncomfortable guilt to her son's inevitable anger. The truth, however, has a way of surfacing eventually, regardless of how carefully it has been buried. It happened nearly 4 months after Alina's departure, during a quiet evening when Sebastian found himself once again reviewing old estate correspondence within his study, searching for some minor administrative detail buried among years of accumulated papers. He came across an old servant registry, listing the various carriages arranged for household use over recent months, and noticed, almost by accident, an unfamiliar entry dated the exact morning of Alina's sudden departure. Curious, he summoned the estate's stable master, a quiet, elderly man named Edmund who had served the Ashworth family faithfully for over 30 years, hoping simply to clarify the administrative discrepancy. "The carriage arranged for that morning," Sebastian asked carefully, showing Edmund the registry entry. "Do you recall who requested it?" Edmund's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of discomfort crossing his weathered features before he carefully composed himself. I believe it was arranged through Clara, your grace, for the young companion's departure. Yes, I am aware Alina used the carriage, Sebastian said, growing slightly impatient. I am asking who specifically requested its arrangement and why the request appears separate from standard household procedures. Edmund hesitated visibly, clearly caught between years of loyal discretion and an obvious reluctance to withhold information directly requested by his employer. Your Grace, he said finally, choosing his words with careful deliberation, I believe it would be more appropriate for you to speak with Clara directly regarding the particular circumstances of that morning. Something cold and urgent settled in Sebastian's chest at the elderly man's careful evasion. Edmund, he said quietly, though his voice carried an unmistakable weight of authority, I am asking you directly, and I expect an honest answer. What do you know about the circumstances surrounding Alina Whitmore's departure? Edmund's composure finally cracked slightly beneath the weight of his employer's direct request. I only know what the other staff have quietly discussed among themselves, Your Grace, he admitted reluctantly, that your mother summoned the young woman privately some days before her departure, and that whatever was discussed during that conversation left Miss Whitmore quite visibly distressed in the days that followed. Sebastian felt the world tilt slightly beneath him, a cold, dawning realization beginning to take shape within his mind. My mother spoke with her privately. So I understand, Your Grace, Edmund confirmed carefully. Though I do not know the specific details of what was discussed, I only observed the change in Miss Whitmore's demeanor afterward and connected the timing to her departure shortly after. Sebastian sat in stunned silence for a long moment, pieces of the devastating puzzle finally beginning to assemble themselves within his mind. Alina's sudden distance in those final days, her formal, distant curtsy that had felt so utterly unlike the warmth they had shared for months, her refusal to offer any genuine explanation for her departure. It had never been a simple change of heart, he realized with growing, horrified clarity. Someone had intervened, deliberately and calculatedly, to drive her away. And he knew, with sickening certainty, exactly who possessed both the motive and the cold, ruthless capability to orchestrate such a devastating interference. He found his mother in the estate's formal sitting room, the same room where, unbeknownst to him, she had delivered her calculated warning to Alina months earlier. Margaret looked up from her needlework as he entered, and something in his expression, raw and furious in a way she had rarely witnessed from her carefully composed son, immediately told her that her carefully guarded secret had finally been discovered. What did you say to her? Sebastian demanded, his voice low and dangerous, stripped entirely of his usual careful composure. Margaret set down her needlework slowly, her expression carefully neutral despite the obvious tension gripping the room. Sebastian, What did you say to Alina? He repeated, his voice rising slightly, years of carefully maintained control finally beginning to crack beneath the weight of months of devastating confusion and grief. She left without explanation, Mother. She curtsied to me as though I were a stranger and walked away, and for 4 months I have believed she simply stopped caring for me. But she did not stop caring, did she? You made certain of her departure. Margaret's composure finally faltered slightly, genuine discomfort visible beneath her carefully maintained exterior. I did what I believed was necessary to protect you, she said quietly. You must understand, Sebastian, I could not simply stand by and watch you. Watch me what? Sebastian interrupted, his voice raw with barely contained fury. Watch me be happy. Watch me finally feel something genuine after years of forcing myself into stone simply to survive this family's endless expectations. Watch you destroy your future for a passing infatuation, Margaret finished firmly, though her voice carried less conviction than her words suggested. Sebastian, I have watched this family's reputation carefully cultivated across generations. I could not allow a companion, however genuine her affection, to threaten everything. You had no right, Sebastian said, his voice quiet now, but carrying a devastating intensity that silenced his mother completely. You had no right to interfere in my life, in my heart, in a decision that belonged entirely to me. Do you understand what you have done? I have spent 4 months believing the woman I loved simply abandoned me without explanation. I have spent 4 months slowly losing whatever small piece of myself I had finally allowed myself to feel again. Margaret's eyes glistened slightly, genuine emotion finally breaking through her carefully maintained composure. I am sorry, she said quietly, for the pain this has caused you. I truly believed I was protecting you from a far greater devastation. You were not protecting me, Sebastian said firmly. You were protecting your own carefully constructed vision of this family's reputation at the expense of my genuine happiness. And in doing so, Mother, you have caused exactly the kind of devastation you claim to be preventing." He turned and left the room without waiting for further response, his mind already racing forward, past the raw anger and devastating betrayal, toward a single, urgent question that suddenly consumed his entire being. Where had Alina gone? And more importantly, was there still time to find her, to finally offer her the truth, and the fight for their future that his mother's calculated interference had so cruelly stolen from them both months earlier? Finding Alina proved far more difficult than Sebastian initially anticipated. She had left no forwarding address, and the small carriage company Clara had quietly arranged kept minimal records of individual passenger destinations. For nearly 2 weeks, Sebastian pursued every possible lead with a desperate, single-minded determination that surprised even the household staff, who had grown accustomed to his usual reserved efficiency. He finally located a crucial clue through Clara herself, who, after witnessing Sebastian's genuine devastation and learning the full truth of Margaret's interference, felt compelled to share the small piece of information Alina had mentioned during their final quiet conversation, an offhand remark about a distant cousin living in a small town called Millbrook, several days' journey from the estate. She did not explicitly say she was traveling there, Clara admitted carefully, clearly still hesitant about betraying whatever remained of Alina's privacy. But it was the only family connection she ever mentioned to me during her time here. It was enough for Sebastian. Within hours, he had arranged for his fastest carriage and set out toward Millbrook, driven by a desperate hope that this single, fragile clue might finally lead him back to the woman whose absence had left such devastating emptiness within his life. The journey took 3 long days, during which Sebastian found himself replaying countless memories of their brief time together, the quiet conversations in the garden, her gentle honesty during his aunt's crisis, the warmth in her eyes as they stood together within the forgotten stone cottage, imagining a future neither of them had been permitted to fully claim. He thought, too, of his mother's calculated interference, and felt a fresh wave of anger every time he considered how close he had come to losing Alina permanently, simply because neither of them had known the truth behind her sudden departure. Millbrook proved to be a small, quiet town, considerably different from the grand estate Alina had left behind. Sebastian made careful, discreet inquiries at the town's small inn, describing Alina as best he could, and finally received confirmation from the innkeeper's wife, who recognized his description immediately. "That would be Miss Whitmore," the woman confirmed. "She has been staying with her cousin these past months, teaching lessons to some of the local children. Kind woman, though she has carried a certain sadness about her since she arrived." Sebastian felt his heart race at the confirmation, following the woman's careful directions toward a modest cottage on the town's quiet outskirts, where, she explained, Alina had established a small, informal schoolroom for local children whose families could not afford more formal education. He arrived at the cottage in the late afternoon, the golden autumn light casting long shadows across the small garden path leading toward the modest front door. Through an open window, he could hear the gentle sound of children's laughter, and beneath it, unmistakably, Alina's voice, warm and patient, guiding her young students through some lesson with genuine affection evident in every word. He stood frozen for a long moment outside the cottage, suddenly uncertain despite his desperate determination throughout the long journey. What if she had truly moved forward, found peace in this new, simpler life, and his sudden reappearance only threatened to disrupt whatever fragile contentment she had managed to build for herself? But he had come too far, endured too much devastating confusion and grief, to retreat now without at least attempting to offer her the truth she deserved. He approached the cottage door and knocked firmly, his heart pounding loudly in his chest as he waited. The door opened, and Alina stood before him, momentarily frozen in shock at the sight of him standing on her modest doorstep. She looked different somehow, Sebastian thought, though he could not quite articulate the change. Perhaps simply more tired, the weight of the past months visible in the shadows beneath her eyes, though her natural warmth and gentle strength remained clearly evident beneath the exhaustion. "Sebastian," she breathed, clearly struggling to comprehend his sudden, impossible presence, "what are you doing here?" "I know the truth," he said simply, his voice carrying months of accumulated grief and anger and desperate hope all at once. "I know what my mother said to you, Alina. I know why you truly left." Alina's expression shifted rapidly through several emotions, shock and fear, and something that looked almost like relief, all crossing her features in quick succession. "Sebastian, may I come in?" he asked gently, aware of the curious glances beginning to gather from neighboring cottages. "Please, I have traveled a long way and there is much I need to say to you." Alina hesitated only a moment before stepping aside, allowing him entrance into the small, simply furnished cottage. She quickly dismissed her young students for the day, her hands visibly trembling as she guided them gently toward the door, before finally turning to face Sebastian fully, once the last child had disappeared down the garden path. "How did you find me?" she asked quietly. "It does not matter how," Sebastian said, closing the distance between them. "What matters is that I finally understand why you left, Alina. My mother summoned you privately, did she not? She threatened you with warnings of social ruin, painted a devastating picture of our future together, convinced you that leaving was the only way to truly protect me." Lena's eyes filled with tears at his accurate understanding, all the pain and sacrifice of the past months finally acknowledged after weeks of silent suffering. "I did not want to leave," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "I have never wanted anything less in my entire life. But your mother made such a convincing case, Sebastian. She said that if I truly loved you, I would understand that sometimes love means releasing someone rather than binding them to a future that would ultimately destroy them." "She was wrong," Sebastian said firmly, reaching gently for her hands. These past 4 months without you have been the most devastating period of my entire life. I have moved through my days like a hollow shell, performing duties without genuine feeling, wondering endlessly what I had done to drive you away. When I finally learned the truth, I felt such overwhelming anger, not only at my mother's interference, but at myself for not fighting harder in that moment, for allowing your formal curtsy and careful distance to convince me that you had simply stopped caring. I curtsied because it was the only way I could leave without breaking down completely," Alina admitted, tears now falling freely down her cheeks. "If I had allowed myself even a moment of genuine emotion, I would never have found the strength to walk away, regardless of how convinced I was that leaving was necessary." Sebastian gently wiped away her tears, his own eyes glistening with barely contained emotion. "You do not need that strength any longer," he said softly. "I am done allowing fear of society's judgment or my mother's calculated warnings to dictate the course of my happiness. I love you, Alina, not despite the complications our love creates, but entirely, completely, regardless of whatever obstacles remain between us." "Sebastian," Alina said, her voice trembling with equal parts hope and lingering fear, "nothing has truly changed. Your mother's warnings about society, about the consequences you would face, none of that has disappeared simply because we now understand the truth of my departure." "You are right," Sebastian agreed. "The challenges remain real, Alina. Society may indeed judge us harshly. Some doors may close that were previously open to my family. But I have spent 4 months living without you, believing our brief happiness together was simply a temporary illusion. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that whatever challenges society presents pale in comparison to the emptiness I felt during your absence." He knelt then, unexpectedly, before her, and Alina's breath caught at the significance of the gesture, understanding immediately what he intended even before he spoke. "I am not offering you a title, or wealth, or the empty comfort of social standing," Sebastian said, his voice steady despite the raw vulnerability evident in his expression. "I am offering you my genuine heart, Alina, the one you helped me rediscover after years of believing myself made of nothing but cold, unfeeling stone. I am asking you to return with me, not as my companion, not as some hidden secret to be managed carefully away from society's judgment, but openly, proudly, as the woman I intend to marry, regardless of whatever consequences that choice may bring." Alina stared down at him, tears flowing freely now, overwhelmed by the depth of sincerity evident in every word he spoke. "Your mother will never accept this," she said softly, though her voice carried far less certainty than her earlier warnings, hope beginning to override her lingering fear. "My mother," Sebastian said firmly, rising to stand before her once more, "will need to accept that my happiness is no longer hers to control. I have spent my entire life allowing others to dictate the shape of my existence, first my father's cold expectations, then society's endless judgment, and finally my mother's calculated interference. I am done, Alina. I choose you openly and completely, regardless of whatever storm that choice may bring against us." Alina searched his eyes carefully, searching for any trace of hesitation or doubt, and finding only steady, unwavering certainty staring back at her. Slowly, she felt the last remnants of her carefully constructed resolve, the same resolve that had allowed her to walk away those many months earlier, finally crumble away entirely, replaced by a fragile, desperate hope she had not allowed herself to feel since leaving Ashworth Estate. "I love you," she said finally, the words carrying months of suppressed longing and devastating sacrifice. "I have loved you since that first quiet evening beside the fountain, and every day since has only deepened that love, regardless of the distance and silence I forced between us." "Then come home with me," Sebastian said softly, gently cupping her face in his hands. "Not to hide, not to remain silent and unacknowledged, but to build the future we both deserve, openly and without fear." Elena nodded slowly, fresh tears falling as she finally allowed herself to fully embrace the happiness she had sacrificed so painfully months earlier. Sebastian pulled her gently into his arms, and for a long, precious moment, they simply held each other, the weight of months of separation and devastating misunderstanding finally beginning to lift between them. Their return to Ashworth Estate, several days later, was met with considerable surprise among the household staff, though Clara's expression carried unmistakable relief at seeing Elena once more, and particularly at witnessing the genuine happiness restored to Sebastian's previously hollow demeanor. Lady Beatrice, upon learning the full truth of the situation, expressed fierce, unrestrained joy at their reunion, along with an equally fierce anger directed toward her sister-in-law's calculated interference. The confrontation with Margaret Ashworth proved difficult, though considerably less devastating than either Sebastian or Elena had anticipated. Faced with her son's absolute, unwavering determination, and perhaps genuinely humbled by witnessing the devastating consequences of her earlier interference, Margaret ultimately offered a careful, if imperfect, acceptance of their relationship, recognizing that her continued opposition risked losing her son's trust entirely. Society, as expected, did not universally embrace their unconventional match. Some doors did indeed close, some previous acquaintances did indeed distance themselves from the family's changing reputation. But Sebastian, true to his promise, faced these consequences with steady resolve, discovering that the genuine happiness he found in his marriage to Elena far outweighed whatever social costs their unconventional love required him to pay. They were married the following spring, in a quiet ceremony held within the estate's garden, beside the very fountain where their story had first quietly begun. Elena wore no elaborate gown, no extravagant jewels befitting a duchess's typical wedding, choosing instead a simple dress that reflected the genuine, unpretentious nature of the love they had fought so hard to reclaim. Years later, the small stone cottage near the eastern woods stood fully restored, no longer forgotten or abandoned, but transformed into a warm, welcoming retreat where Sebastian and Elena often retreated together, away from the estate's formal expectations, to simply exist as themselves, free from titles and society's endless judgment. And though the painful months of separation, and the devastating misunderstanding caused by a single silent curtsy, remained a difficult memory neither of them ever fully forgot, they often spoke of that period as a necessary if painful chapter in their story, one that ultimately taught them both the true unwavering strength of a love genuine enough to survive even the deepest silence, and courageous enough, once truth was finally revealed, to fight fiercely for the happiness it so deeply deserved. Life at Ashworth Estate settled, in time, into something neither Sebastian nor Elena had truly believed possible during those painful months of separation. Yet settling did not mean their journey together was free of further tests, and the years that followed brought new challenges neither of them had fully anticipated when they exchanged their quiet vows beside the garden fountain. The first true test arrived within their second year of marriage, when Sebastian's business partners, uneasy about the family's changing social standing, began quietly withdrawing from several important agreements that had long supported the estate's tenant farmers and surrounding villages. Sebastian found himself facing mounting pressure from extended family members and former allies, all suggesting, in carefully worded letters, that perhaps a more traditional match might have spared the family such difficulties. Elena watched him struggle with these pressures, noticing the familiar tightness returning to his jaw, the same guarded exhaustion she had first glimpsed beside the fountain years earlier. But this time, rather than retreating into distant silence, Sebastian turned toward her, sharing his frustrations openly, trusting her counsel in ways his father had never trusted anyone. "Perhaps my mother was not entirely wrong," he admitted one evening, sitting heavily in his study, surrounded by correspondence reflecting the mounting difficulties. Our marriage has cost this estate several important relationships. Alina considered his words carefully before responding. Difficulties are not the same as destruction, Sebastian. Every choice carries consequences. But I have watched you these past years, and I have never once seen you happier, nor more genuinely engaged with the people who depend on this estate. Perhaps some partners were never truly aligned with the values this family should represent. Her steady confidence reminded him of the same quiet strength that had first drawn him to her within the garden years earlier, and slowly, together, they began rebuilding the estate's business relationships on entirely new foundations, seeking partners who valued genuine character over rigid social convention. It proved slower work than the old arrangements, but ultimately far more resilient, built on mutual respect rather than mere tradition. Their efforts eventually bore fruit in unexpected ways. The small village schoolhouse Alina established on the estate grounds, mirroring the informal lessons she had once offered in Millbrook, gradually earned recognition throughout the surrounding countryside for its innovative approach to education, welcoming children regardless of their family's social standing. Sebastian, drawing on the architectural dreams he had abandoned in his youth, personally designed the schoolhouse's expansion himself, finally allowing that buried childhood passion to find genuine, meaningful expression. Margaret Ashworth, though her relationship with Alina never became particularly warm, gradually developed a grudging, genuine respect for her daughter-in-law's quiet resilience and evident devotion to Sebastian's happiness. Their reconciliation remained imperfect, marked by careful formality rather than genuine closeness, but Margaret eventually acknowledged, in a rare moment of honest vulnerability during a quiet visit several years into the marriage, that she had perhaps mistaken her own fear of change for genuine wisdom regarding her son's happiness. "I still believe I was attempting to protect you," Margaret told Sebastian during that visit, watching Alina through the window, laughing gently with a group of village children in the garden below. "But I have come to understand that protection sometimes causes far greater harm than the danger it attempts to prevent." It was perhaps the closest thing to a genuine apology Margaret ever offered, and Sebastian, though he never fully forgot the devastating consequences of her earlier interference, found himself grateful for even this imperfect acknowledgement, allowing a fragile, careful peace to eventually settle between mother and son. Lady Beatrice lived several more years following Alina's return, her health gradually strengthening enough to witness the birth of Sebastian and Alina's first child, a daughter they named after her, much to the elderly woman's fierce, unrestrained delight. "You have given this family something it desperately needed," Lady Beatrice told Alina during one of their final conversations together, holding her tiny namesake gently in her frail arms. "Not simply happiness, though that alone would have been gift enough. You have given this family permission to feel genuinely and without shame, after generations of hiding behind cold formality and rigid expectation." Alina treasured those words long after Lady Beatrice's eventual passing, carrying them forward as she and Sebastian raised their growing family within an estate gradually transformed by their combined influence, warmer now, more genuinely welcoming, though it never fully abandoned the dignified formality befitting its long history. The small stone cottage near the eastern woods, fully restored within their first years of marriage, became a cherished retreat for their entire family as the years progressed, a place where Sebastian and Alina's children grew up understanding that titles and social expectation, while important to navigate carefully, need never fully define who a person chose to become. Their eldest son, upon reaching adulthood, expressed genuine interest in architecture, a passion Sebastian encouraged wholeheartedly, having long ago learned the painful cost of suppressing genuine dreams beneath rigid family expectation. Their daughter, following in her mother's footsteps, eventually took over management of the estate's schoolhouse, expanding its reach to serve even more of the surrounding countryside's children. Occasionally, during quiet evenings beside the garden fountain where their story had first quietly begun, Sebastian and Alina found themselves reflecting on those painful months of separation, the devastating silence of a single formal curtsy that had nearly cost them everything they eventually built together. "Do you ever regret how difficult our beginning truly was?" Alina asked him once, many years into their marriage, watching their children play together within the same gardens where she had first glimpsed his guarded loneliness beside the fountain. Sebastian considered the question thoughtfully before answering, his expression carrying none of the guarded distance that had once defined him. "I regret the pain we both endured, certainly," he said finally. "I regret every day we spent apart, believing our love had simply failed rather than understanding the truth of what had truly occurred. But I do not regret the strength that painful separation ultimately revealed within us both. It taught us, I think, that genuine love requires more than simple feeling. It requires courage, honest communication, and a willingness to fight fiercely for happiness, even when the world presents seemingly impossible obstacles." Elena smiled softly, reaching for his hand, the same gentle gesture that had first connected them within the wild meadow years earlier. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "some love stories require difficult beginnings, simply to prove strong enough for whatever challenges still await them." "Perhaps," Sebastian agreed, pulling her gently closer as the evening light faded slowly into gold across the estate grounds. "Though I find myself deeply grateful that whatever difficulties remain ahead, we now face them together, openly and honestly, rather than allowing silence and fear to separate us ever again." Their story, ultimately, became something quietly remembered throughout the surrounding countryside, not as a scandalous tale of a duke's inappropriate attachment to a lowly companion, but as a genuine testament to love's resilience when faced with fear, interference, and painful misunderstanding. Servants who had witnessed their difficult beginning often shared the story with newer household staff, not as cautionary warning, but as quiet inspiration, proof that even the coldest, most guarded hearts could learn, given genuine patience and courage, to feel deeply and authentically once more. And within the quiet stone cottage near the eastern woods, where Sebastian's forgotten architectural dreams had finally found expression, and where their children continued building memories of their own, the worn book of poetry Sebastian had once given Alina remained carefully preserved, its pages worn soft with age, his father's careful handwritten notes still visible in the margins, joined now by new handwriting entirely, gentle words Sebastian had added over the years, small reflections on love, sacrifice, and the quiet, hard-won happiness they had ultimately built together, proof enduring long after either of them remained to tell their story themselves, that even the deepest silence could eventually give way to a love loud enough and strong enough to last generations.